Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled How to Optimize Patient and Clinician Reported Outcome Assessment Data COA in Early Phase Clinical Trials. My name is Samaya and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, you can contact us at any time by sending me a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Clario, who developed the content for this presentation. Clario delivers the leading endpoint technology solutions for clinical trials. Through experience gained from over 19,000 clinical trials delivered in support of 870 regulatory approvals, Clario fuses scientific expertise and global scale into the broadcast endpoint technology platform to enable pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device partners to transform lives. Through Trial Anywhere, Clario has mastered the ability to generate rich evidence across all trial models, decentralized, hybrid, and site-based clinical trials. With 30 facilities in 9 countries across North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific, Clario's global team of science, technology, and operational experts has been delivering the richest clinical evidence for nearly 50 years. So now, without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic to Chris. So Chris, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you to everyone for joining. Welcome to our session today focused on optimizing patient and clinician reported outcome assessment data in early phase research. My name is Chris Vogel. I'm the Executive Director of ECOA Solutions at Clario and the moderator for today's event. From a format perspective, we'll try to keep this Q&A style. We'll ask some frequently asked questions that we get often based on our experience, but certainly invite you all to include questions in the chat, as Maya had mentioned, and we'll address all of those, or as many as time permits at the end of the session. With that being said, I have a few special guests with me that I'd like to introduce. I know I learn something from them every time that I talk with them. I hope you all do the same today. So let's get started with introductions. Brian, you want to lead off?
Sure, thank you, Chris. Great to be here. So my name is Brian McDowell. I'm the VP of Eco Science and Consulting at Clario. I've been in the industry the pharmaceutical industry for about 25 years. And one of my passions and strong beliefs is the ability for the industry to continue to strive to make clinical development smarter and better. Whether that's through the use of technologies or greater operational efficiencies, I think it behooves us all to look at how we can play our own parts in bringing new and innovative treatment to countless people around the world and extend and improve their lives.
And Kelly.
Sorry, I was on mute. Hi, I'm Kelly Dumay. I'm a principal scientific advisor at Clario, where I consult on best practices for instrument design and ECOA design to drive data quality and patient engagement. I believe in the need to create more patient-focused drug development programs, and I'm excited to talk to you today on the importance of keeping the patient at the forefront and the need to incorporate COAs in early phase trials. So good to be here.
And last but most certainly not least, Donna.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar about a topic very close to my heart for many, many years. I've worked closely with many companies who have believed there are better ways to collect and use COA, but often overlook the advantages of including COA in early phases. So I hope today's discussion sheds some light on why starting earlier is a better strategy.
Perfect. So we have lots to cover, a packed agenda. So let's jump in. And Donna, maybe I'll start with you. Help me get a baseline here. What is ECOA? What does the audience need to understand about it? Just let's get started with a basic definition.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, again, I think We've done a really good job with alphabet confusion over the years. In the beginning, we only ever talked about PRO, but then the term COA came into existence. And COA stands for Clinical Outcome Assessment, not Clinician Outcome Assessment. So COA is broken into 4 subcategories depending on the type of data you're collecting and who is reporting that data. So the most commonly used COA is something called patient-reported outcome, or PRO. Examples of this include things like diaries, quality of life, health economic questionnaires, treatment symptoms, impressions of change maybe, and including things like suicide ideation if it's self-reported by the patient. So the thing that really defines PRO is that the patient is capable of self-reporting on their symptoms, the severity, and the frequency. And this is often done either at home, but can also be done during something such as a visit. And when I speak about visit today, I don't mean a site visit. Visit for me is a milestone in a protocol, a time point, and it can be done remotely, it can be done virtually, or it can be done face-to-face. The next category commonly used is the clinician reported outcomes. And again, I can't stress enough, this is not clinical reported outcome, this is clinician reported outcome. And this is refers to data entered by a trained health professional. It's his or her interpretation of how the patient is reporting symptoms, but is also about the clinician's perception of the patient's health. And examples of this are often the physician's general assessment, the physician's general impression of change, a BDI, TDI in COPD, swollen and tender joints in arthritis. So these are more rating scales such as the PASI or the SCORAD in dermatology. EDSS is the gold standard rating scale, ClinRO for multiple sclerosis. HAM-D is a depression scale. Again, it's the physician doing an interview of the patient and determining the level of depression. The same as, again, suicidal ideation behavior, but in this instance, as a ClinRO, it is an interview that the clinician, a scripted interview that the clinician is performing with the patient. These are almost always done during a visit. And once again, the visit can be virtual, face-to-face, whatever. The third category is the observer reported outcome. And this is very similar to a PRO. However, and in fact, it's the same thing as PRO, but this time it is actually being done by somebody who actually is observing the general daily living lifestyle of this patient. It is a non-clinical caregiver. And that's the differentiation between a ClinRO and an observer row, is this person is not a trained clinical person. The examples are everything I just said about PRO, but this is usually used when patients are not capable to self-report. And this could be the reasons why maybe they have some cognitive deficiency. It could be a pediatric study. It could be the patient has sight impairment, or the patient is illiterate. And again, these are usually done at home, but can also be done during the visit time point. The last category is probably the least commonly talked about, but often included in protocols, are performance outcomes. The examples of this are things like a 6-minute walk test, time up and go in COPD, cognitive testing, and even things such as a lung function test where a patient is asked to do a test that is quantifiable and measurable. So blowing into a puff, you have to be coached, and to do it correctly is a test of my performance. The performance metrics can actually be facilitated by the inclusion of activity meters, for example, or other passive wearables, such as blood pressure monitors or heart monitors as well. All of these can be done either on paper or collected electronically. So the word eCOA is just the electronic data capture of all of the same things.
Lots more to come on that debate, Donna. Thank you. That's a perfect baseline, understanding COA as the umbrella and the various forms that can come in underneath. That's really helpful. Kelly, why is it important? Why should folks be thinking about this? Why is collecting COA in trials something that's important?
Yeah, so there are so many reasons why measuring or collecting COAs are important, and especially for early phase trials. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk through this and why it's important really for that early phase. And one of the biggest reasons is that, collecting COAs allows you to really incorporate the patient voice. It allows you to be patient-centric. And what do I mean by that? It means that, using COAs allow you to understand how treatment impacts how a patient feels and functions in a way that other types of endpoints can't. So generally, efficacy can be evaluated in a couple different ways. You have your biomarkers, those objective measurements, the imaging scans, labs, physiological measurements, and then you have your COAs, those clinical assessments. And really what we've learned over the years is that even when something has a well-known, reliable biomarkers, that when that exists, they don't always correlate with how the patient actually feels, meaning you could get a significant improvement in something like a physiological or anatomical measure, but that improvement might not actually translate to improvements in symptoms. So take, for instance, COPD. Endpoints are largely based on lung function tests such as spirometry that can be more of an objective measure, a perfo, but also the objective measure of lung function. And that doesn't always account really for the full impact of the disease on the patient. So, COPD, for instance, has a major impact on patient activity levels, quality of life that only show a weak correlation to something like just lung function. So collecting only lung function won't provide that big picture of how the patient feels. You have to also collect other types of COAs, such as patient-reported outcomes, to really get that more complete picture. Another good example is oncology. There's been lots of attention on oncology and collecting more information on clinical benefit beyond those objective measures of, say, survival or tumor response. Those are undoubtedly important, but doesn't, again, take into account how the patient is actually feeling. Will their symptoms improve? Will they be able to work? Will they be able to take care of their family? So it's extremely important to incorporate things such as COAs, patient-reported outcomes, to really understand how the patient's feeling. So, incorporating COAs early in study development give the patient that avenue to tell us how the treatment is really impacting them from the very beginning. Incorporating COAs early also allows you to optimize your phase 3 strategy. So incorporating COAs early gives you that opportunity to potentially explore new endpoints or new technologies. You can explore new ways to measure patient functioning, for instance, such as wearable devices. And early phase studies kind of provide you that type of test run of your COA strategy. So what did you learn in phase 2? So you know what might need to be improved for phase 3. So were symptom assessments missing in phase 2? Were COAs collected too frequently or not frequently enough? Were the patients confused or frustrated with the types of questions being asked? Was your COA strategy too burdensome for either sites or patients? Maybe this caused low compliance. So these are the things you want to discover early, so you can kind of course correct that for phase 3 and be confident that your phase 3 COA strategy will really work for your patients. It also could allow you to differentiate your drug in the market, right? So going back to the oncology example, it can be more than being patient focused. It could be, being able to differentiate your drug in a very, very competitive market, such as one for oncology in the last 6 years has been over 150 drug approvals. So the need to differentiate is high. Incorporating the right COA strategy and being innovative in your strategy and your endpoints. And by testing that in early phase, making sure you're getting it right in phase 3, it can make your drug stand out from the rest. I also have evaluating tolerability here. This has received a lot of attention, again, in oncology space. For oncology, there has been important research demonstrating the advantage of collecting tolerability data via something like patient-reported measures. So in addition to those objective measures of toxicity, and even in addition to clinician-reported measures of AEs, a more optimal dose-finding strategy might be including PROs. It allows patients to self-report those symptoms they're experiencing, provide more granularity, like frequency and severity, and how it really impacts their daily functioning. And it has been found that those the reports of how it impacts daily functioning that you get from the pro-CTCAE, that's correlated with the need for dose reduction in oncology. So it's really an important area that I think people will start exploring more. And then finally here, being submission ready. So there is a lot of regulatory emphasis on incorporating the patient voice right now. So regulatory agencies will really expect to see that you're incorporating the right COAs. And importantly, a considerable number of drug approvals have been based on non-phase 3 trials. So again, going back to, well, why do I need to do it early? Via expedited drug approval pathways, many treatments, such as for cancer or for rare disease, can be approved based on phase 2 trial data. So especially for those indications and approval pathways, your COA strategy really needs to be regulatory compliant from the very beginning in those early phases. So in summary, incorporating COAs early allows you to incorporate that voice. Why is that important? There's a lot of regulatory emphasis on that recently, and it's also just the right thing to do, right? So we're running clinical trials to get drugs to market to improve symptoms, improve disease, improve lives. So it's almost impossible to think about how we can do that without allowing patients to use their voice through COAs to tell us how they're feeling from the very beginning in those early phase trials.
You led me right to it, Kelly, and kind of took the next question out of my head, and you alluded a bit to it regarding regulators, but what evidence or what information is out there on the stance from regulatory agencies on a global scale is there regarding capturing PROS?
Yeah, so regulatory agencies have, numerous guidances specifically on the collection of COAs, generally, meaning across therapy areas, and then also specifically for individual therapy areas and indications. So the guidelines that span kind of across therapy areas, there's a pivotal 2009 FDA PRO guidance that provides recommendations for when you're including PROs to support labeling claims. And now FDA is in the process of releasing a 4-series documents dedicated to patient-focused drug development. So these are 4 distinct guidance documents that recommend methods for understanding what is important to patients, and then how to incorporate what you found there and what's important to patients, and develop and modify COAs that are fit for purpose for your trial. So the important message really from these guidances and across regulatory agents generally is that it's extremely important that you are measuring what is important to patients, and that's based on what is important to them based on interviews with them and asking them what's important to them, so not based on any assumptions we might have. And then the COAs that are used to collect that information, they need to be valid, reliable, appropriate for use in the context of your trial. So there are lots of information out there generally on the use of COAs, and then there are many that are, as I mentioned, indication specific, therapy area specific, because the types of COAs to use, so is it a ClinRO, PRO, or PERFO, and what endpoints they should be supporting, primary, secondary, et cetera, of course will vary widely across TAs. And COAs will be especially important for those indications that are highly symptomatic, where it is best to be asking the patient how they're feeling, and those that are significantly known to impact quality of life. So for a lot of those highly symptomatic diseases, such as pain, migraine, asthma, gastrointestinal disorders, regulatory guidances can get pretty specific about what COAs to include and what endpoints they should be supporting. So highly recommend that for whatever indication you're studying, you're really looking at those guidances, because they can get very specific on what they're recommending. To give you just a couple examples, just this year, the FDA released guidances on ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, and it describes the required patient-reported abdominal pain and stool frequency, et cetera, that should be collected in a diary, in an electronic diary, to support the primary endpoint. There's ones on migraine, vasomotor symptoms, on really describing what patient-reported outcomes should be supporting the primary endpoint there. And there are really just so many that we don't have enough time to go through them all, but just wanted to highlight a few there. And when it comes to, again, that question of early phase, do regulatory guidances change by phase? Most of what you'll see in terms of formal guidances that make recommendations for efficacy evaluations, they're aimed at what they expect to see in your registrational trials, right? So mostly your phase 3. But as mentioned earlier, incorporating COAs in early phase allows you to get your phase 3 strategy right. And also mentioned earlier, some drugs go through that expedited pathway. You might be using your phase 2 trial data as your basis of drug approval. So these regulatory guidance recommendations really apply to your entire drug development program. And on the slide here, while we're on the topic of regulations, we're going to get deep into, different ways to collect COAs and the advantages of electronic data collection to improve that data quality. And this is just something to point out that a lot of regulatory guidances are specifically endorsing, electronic collection of COAs, with the reasons being, improving data quality, reducing missing data, reducing patient burden, and some of those are very indication specific, like the ulcerative colitis one you see there, oncology, Crohn's disease. They actually specifically highlight the usefulness of an electronic data capture to really make sure that you're collecting high quality data. So there's lots, we could spend the whole hour just on regulations, but I'll leave it at that for now.
That's perfect. I get it now. I know why it's important. I get the regulatory stance. But Brian, for the sponsors and CRO attendees in the audience here, what's involved in defining a strategy behind this? Like, when should I start thinking about it, and what should I be thinking about?
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Kelly, for the background and the regulations. I think it's important all strategies should be based around the regulatory environment that we live in as well. It's never too early to build strategies. It's probably the easy answer to my part here. But we do need to really understand, I can't make it any clearer that COA is more than just a questionnaire. There's a lot more thought that goes into this than just what questions are we asking the patients within trials. Good eco and instrument design are absolutely critical to the success of the study. And when you merge science, the expertise of science into an eco strategy, you add to that very success. And by doing so, you should be able to minimize patient and site burden, maximize the value of the data you're collecting, along with the high quality data you'll be collecting if you're using, in my opinion, electronic versions of these tools. That will help you unlock that clinical evidence that will drive your product forward in the early phase through to potentially phase 3 if it reaches that far, and on through to being launched. That being said, there's no one size fits all in terms of strategy. Kelly was speaking about the various different regulations that exist on different indication levels. So we do need to take into consideration the population of the study, whether that's the age and demographics, etc., but also the indication, what might be in your target product profile within your company of where this product is going, how long is the study lasting, and many, many other aspects. So when we ask the question of when should we get involved and start building this eco strategy, in the early phases is the ideal time to do that. You can start to tweak these strategies as you go forward and see which directions they might be going, which will in turn help give you more value to your development programs and bring you greater data and greater quality, and improve the chances of success of your program as you move forward through the stages, or through the different development phases. Some of the more sort of basic considerations, to give an example, just simple ones, is, are the questions, I'm using that term broadly, are the questions being asked valuable and relevant to the study? And quite often we've seen questions that have nothing to do with what's in the protocol. Let's keep this specific, let's keep it focused, let's get to those questions that you really do need to be answered. Are there too many questions? Are there too many forms the patients need to fill out? And therefore, we're going to see impact on compliance, burden of the patients will increase, or the sites, depending whether it's a ClinRo or Pro, or indeed even an Obsro or Perfo. We've got to look at the number of forms and questions that might be being completed. Is there overlap? Again, we quite often see you may be adding 2 or 3 different quality of life forms into your e-diary. You may have different forms that may give the opportunity of contradictory information being added that may cause some confusion. So you've got to get the balance right. You've got to use the right tools and instruments to make sure you have a good, solid, and robust diary that, with a good strategy, will absolutely minimize burden and repetition of questions. Will prioritize ease of completion, enhance patient engagement, and we'll hear a little bit more about that down the road, and ensure only the relevant data that will help the goals and objectives of the study be achieved is being collected. That's it in summary, but it's certainly never, ever, ever too early to build a good COA strategy.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. I think from a baseline perspective, that's good. I think we're all on the same page now. I want to shift gears and do a little audience participation, make sure everyone's awake and with us. So We're going to switch into more of the data collection section. And to start that off, we want to just get a sense from you guys. What's the biggest barrier that you have when you consider, when thinking about collecting clinical outcome assessments between paper and electronic? So we put up some of the more common objections that we typically hear at Clario. I greatly wanted a free text option in here, but the software wouldn't support it, because I'm so curious to see if there are others we haven't thought about. But yeah, please, chime in, and we'll get the results here in a second. I think we probably got the gist of it here, Smaya, if we want to see what the results are looking like. Interesting. Okay, cost definitely comes up as one of the, so cost and timelines. Okay, so that's definitely helpful. We'll certainly address both of these as we move forward here. But always interesting to see where everyone's head's at when it comes to thinking about the difference between paper and electronic. And I think that's the perfect segue we could move into. So Donna, let's talk about the options, right? Paper, electronic. Talk us through some considerations. What do we need to think about?
So here's just a really good visual. I have used this visual of paper diaries for the last 25 years, actually. This is a very typical paper diary. It's only 4 questions. The patient has been instructed to do this every day at 8 p.m. Now on paper, that's really hard to know if they're going to really do it every day at 8 p.m. or not. And there is some data to suggest that patients often do this in the parking lot before their next visit. But the first example is the illogical patient, where this diary, they were asked to answer these 4 questions. The date, first question is, did you take your study medication today? Yes or no? And this patient said no. Then they rated their pain on the Likert scale. And then the last question was asking about the tolerability. Did their study medication upset them at all today? And he said a lot. Yet in the first question, he said he didn't take it. So this is illogical information. The next one is the selective patient. Again, he's answered only 2 of the 4 questions. Put in the date and assumed it's done at 8 p.m. He skipped the first question about study medication and the last question about study medication, but he went ahead and rated his pain today. So the question would be, from a statistical point of view, is this evaluable information? Can you really determine, if I didn't take my study medication, which was against pain, and I rated my pain, is one without the other useful? And then the last one is the enthusiastic patient. This is the patient everybody wants in their trial. This patient wants to tell us how they felt throughout the whole day. Did they take their medication? Yeah, they took some of it, but not all of it, because it was hard to swallow. The pain wasn't bad in the morning, and now it's bad, and I have a headache now. So, the design of this paper diary didn't allow that information. So none of what he's scribbled in the margins is useful. And it does point out that the design of this diary for this pain study probably wasn't optimal. And that would be true if you're doing it on paper or electronic. So the electronic can avoid the illogical data entry. The electronic format can avoid the selective patient. So all questions have to be answered one at a time, and there can trigger branching. So if I said I didn't take my study medication today, it wouldn't ask the question if it upset me or not. So you can avoid the illogical. The enthusiastic patient, you might get frustrated because the diary design is still not optimized for this indication. They still wouldn't be able to write in stuff in the margins, which is controversial, so should we allow free text or not? And today's technology can allow it. So that's just a really starting point for what is the difference between paper and electronic. So if we go to the next slide. So let's go dig a little bit deeper. So the options for collecting COA data, obviously we've said it can be done on paper or electronic. And the most important thing is, and this is what Kelly and Brian have already said, that we need to make this flexible, has to fit into the life and the time expectations of the patient, and it should be familiar to them. So back in the day when we started with e-diaries, it was not familiar. People didn't have smartphones back then. We had to turn in PDAs, Palm Pilots, into smartphones, and it was unheard of, So it was a big challenge to get people familiar with the technology. Today, everybody has a smartphone. It amazes me as an older person sitting on the bus and seeing how many people are pulling out their smartphones. So it's no longer unfamiliar territory anymore. Electronic tablets and smartphones are more familiar. But there is a principle that is part of the FDA data integrity principles called ALCOA, and this is true for GXP. So originally there were only 5 principles, and it's been expanded to 9. And that is that it's called ALCOA, which stands for attributability. So the person who performs a data-related task must be identifiable as the person who performed that task. And in electronic world, that's done using logins and passwords. On paper, as I've shown you before, it's really just the patient saying, I'm doing this. It's difficult to know exactly who did it or when they did it. Legibility is the other one. Data has to be readable and, importantly, understandable. Contemporaneous, difficult word to say, is that the data activity should be time-stamped with a record of when it took place. So again, on paper, that's a difficult thing to do unless you have some hidden technology like a photo sensor or something that can capture the date and time when the paper has been exposed. Original, so every piece of data originally captured must be retained. It shouldn't be replaced or deleted. Accuracy, so the data should be inputted, stored, and maintained with high precision and validity. It must be complete, so all data expected data should be answered, and if there are any revisions, an audit trail of those revisions must be included. Consistent, it has to be displayed consistently wherever it's accessed. Enduring is talking about the archive, so we must have a readable and accessible archive throughout the period of when it might be needed. And then available data, which is the last of the integrity principles, means that the data should be accessible in a readable format to all people who are responsible for review of that data. And again, on paper, that becomes more and more difficult to do. So if you think about paper, the site is asking the patient to follow instructions. Electronic, we can do the training. Sorry, go back one slide. The training and the instructions can be electronically presented. If the data is done at home, the date and timestamp is more important than if you're doing the forms at the site, where it's a supervised environment, so the site could be responsible for making sure it's done at the right visit at the right time. But it gets more and more difficult to make sure that they're done in the right order, and more difficult to demonstrate ALCOA even in that instance. So I've talked a lot about data collection. Let's switch now to the next slide and talk
Donna,
about.
could I just add a question in there? If I'm understanding correctly, thanks, Donna. It seems to me that it's virtually impossible to meet all the Alcoa plus criteria on paper, particularly if it's being completed away from the investigational facility.
That's very true, and it supports what Kelly talked about, the regulatory need. If you're investigating a treatment for something that's very symptomatic, that's why the FDA and EMEA are saying that in order to meet this ALCOA principles, electronic data capture would be the way to go.
Okay, thank you.
So what I've found over the many conversations I've had with many people, very often we talk about data capture and we forget about what to do with the data once it's captured. So if you're capturing data, and it's important to be able to monitor that data, the data quality, monitor the data to determine protocol adherence, is a patient in the screening period the right amount of time? If you've on paper, they continue to complete the screening diaries for 3 months, when the screening period was only 3 weeks, you've missed out on a lot of data if they have actually been randomized. Whereas electronic world, with real-time reporting, you can detect that and take corrective action in real time. You can also follow enrollment in real time and patient retention in real time. So the other important part is safety. So are the patients completing the diaries every day? So if you see low compliance, that's not a safety signal, but you're going to get less quality data, and you can make corrective actions there. But also you can include notifications to the site when a patient might start reporting that they have worsening symptoms, or increased use of rescue medications, or increased use of hospital or health-related utilization. So these are kinds of things that are not COA in a sense, but the data around COA that can help you detect when corrective actions need to be taken.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a really good description between paper and electronic data. I think we've definitely highlighted some of the pitfalls from a paper perspective. So Brian, if folks in the audience are thinking about how to capture this data, what options are there from an electronic perspective?
Sure. So as we see on the next slide, multiple options exist, and clearly there's benefits for each of these types of options depending on the population under study, and what their needs or disease and lifestyle may require. But from starting from left to right, of course, is provision devices. We've the Clario in this case can provision devices to each of the participants in the study, so that they would have the diary on a study-specific device. We'll speak about how that can also be used in more context with other connected devices a little bit later. We'll also look at tablets, which can be very much used at site or within or in a patient's home, again, depending on the patient population under study. And we have BYOD, or bring your own device, which is also quite popular, where an app is installed onto the device that would replicate what the eDiary and the eCOA components would look like. Clearly, there's also the web-based opportunities as well that exist on the home computer. So across the myriad devices, they do exist. And again, this goes back a little bit into the strategy that I spoke about earlier. Some devices, some approaches are better suited for some populations, and it's all part of looking into that into having enough flexibility in your strategy to accommodate the population. Understood. We'll look at that a little bit later as we go forward, but in essence, there's many opportunities and different options of devices to capture color.
So device independent. What else would sponsors think about? Any practical examples as they decide between electronic and paper capture?
Yeah, it was one of my favorites because I was involved in this study many years ago while I was at Novartis. These publications in the public domain. We were looking at this. There's plenty of different folds into this study. One is that it's just in men only. It was one of a study that needed to be done because there was a lack of male participation in the original studies. However, the sample size for this study was based upon the responses to paper diaries in the previous pivotal studies, and therefore this was calculated to be 1,026. I'm going to call that 1,050 just to make my maths simple in my own head here. For reasons outside of this study, the study was stopped when 322 or 350 patients had been enrolled. So about a third of the patients have been enrolled in this 3-arm study. When the data was analyzed, we found that we'd already reached statistical significance after only having recruited 1/3 of the anticipated patients. Now, that's a big jump and a really interesting finding. Again, just a reminder, the sample size was based on paper diaries. When we looked at the data in much more detail, it was clear that the variance, the deviation was much smaller through the use of electronic diaries, which is what we did in this study in conservation in men. So we had seen that the higher quality data had already allowed us to see significance in a third of the patients compared to what we've seen with paper diaries. That has multiple impacts. One, clearly the cost comes down quite considerably because you're getting higher quality, better accuracy of data, and high quality data is really paramount. You also have shorter recruitment periods, clearly because you've got less patients, so you're going to be faster as well. So there's costs and times that come into this, but it clearly demonstrated from my perspective, this study goes back, it's almost 20 years ago now, really demonstrated the power of using an electronic diary to collect the right data at the right time, at the right frequency, and to ensure that this data was being captured accurately. Then, of course, there might have been a bit of missing data. We have still a very high compliance, but missing data is far better than wrong data. And we've got to keep that in mind as well. So this is where electronic diaries really come into the forefront and demonstrate their value, both in terms of time and money in drug development.
You hit my buzzword, and it was part of back to our poll in the beginning, right? Cost was one of the big things that people think about when evaluating paper to electronic. So let's go there, right? Donna, help us think through some of the costs associated between paper and electronic and what sponsors and CROs should consider.
Yeah, I would have been surprised if the poll had not pointed this out to us. So it's one of these questions that is perpetual. You know, it's always going to be there. And I've done a lot of work actually to try to determine a way to demonstrate what does paper cost. You know, the electronic pricing model, the pricing model for electronic data capture is pretty standard across the industry now, but the paper cost is not. So I did go back and do some research, and the best I could find was based with the understanding that, you know, you're collecting the data on paper, but you still need an electronic system to enter it into. So there is some cost to build that database so that you're entering this data into a system that can then be used to analyze and merge the data with the rest of the clinical data. So that's the first cost that people don't think about. Secondly, it is double data entry. So you could get away with maybe single data entry and save some money there, but you might end up then with more queries. So if you're doing double data entry and minimizing the error of the data entry itself, you might save on the query resolution cost. You do have to think about source data verification when you're using paper, and that the cost per hour will differ from CRO to CRO, and the estimate of how many hours per patient is required will depend on your strategy. If you're doing 100% SDV versus maybe 10% or random, deciding on that. So I've used here just estimates right now for this example. Printing and shipping costs need to be considered, and then also the cost of licensing and the administration of acquiring those licensing agreements with the copyright holders as well. So in this example of 280 screened, 223 randomized patients at 50 sites, completing weekly diaries for 31 months, and then just two simple questionnaires at 33 visits. The total paper cost, if you cut right down to the bottom, is $960,000. So I sent the same information to Clario, and they were able to come back using their current pricing model that the same study would cost about $984,000. So a difference of about 3%. And again, I am actually not surprised. Every time I have done this exercise on behalf of a customer, it's usually come in with 10%. Sometimes electronic is 10% more, sometimes paper is 10% more. But that 10% rule of thumb has held up over the years. So I'm sure this is surprising some people, and I'm sure we can argue about the rates I've used, but this is a good rule of thumb. I did do some recent research and found a publication from 2017 from the US where the estimated cost of paper data entry was about $12 per page. And in this example comes into about $11.64 per page. So I do think it's a pretty good estimate.
Yeah, perfect sanity check, Donna, thanks. Hopefully that answered some of the questions that folks were concerned about from the cost perspective, but good data there. In the interest of time, I want to keep us moving to the implementation section. So, and Donna alluded to some of this earlier, but Brian, given the benefits of electronic and some of the things we talked about in real-time access to data, what did sponsors and CROs gain from having that access, and how is this enabled when using ECO?
Sure, and thanks, Chris. And I'll try to keep this brief, so I'm interested to hear the audience's questions as well. I think primarily very easy. You know, if you don't have electronic, you're not going to have these real-time reports. You're going to be weeks behind as you get the data from paper, bring it in, the double data entry and onto aspects. So what do these reports enable you to have? Well, clearly very much greater oversight of what's happening during in the study. Right? What is the compliance like? How's the, you know, even you use it for enrollments, use it for the status of studies that go through it. You can use reports to understand the eligibility criteria, how patients are going to be impacted potentially by tough eligibility criteria or not. In addition to that, you can also understand the notifications that might be going out, establish notifications that may be required in case of low adherence to medication, incompletion of diaries, or other aspects, including patient safety. They can also be monitored in real time. From an early phase of development, of course, having that oversight can help inform decisions that you may be wishing to take as you start to develop into the later stages of the studies or of development as well. But with that greater control becomes greater opportunities to really help support the study for patient safety first and enable you to engage and react within real time to situations as they happen.
You mentioned, and I see like two of my favorite words on the slide, compliance and engagement, right? As we think about early phase research for rare disease, finding and retaining patients is a huge deal for sponsors and CROs. Kelly, how does ECOA play into that? What can we do from a compliance and an engagement perspective when using ECOA?
Yeah, so to me, it's all about making it, easy and convenient for the patients to participate, right? So the trial needs to fit in with their lives and expectations, and we've heard this a bit both by Brian and Donna. It's about providing that flexible technology solution that works for them. It's easy for them, and when we make solutions, with them in mind, and this can then lead to high compliance just by design, right? Maybe that means offering them the ability to do pros on their own phone in a BYOD model, making it fit within their lives, making it easy and convenient for them will in fact increase compliance. And then in addition to just those best practices in design and good usability, ECOA can drive high compliance in part by using things like notifications, something you can't get with paper. So those audible and visual alarms. An alarm strategy, however, we really need to be careful of those. So there's a balance between, not frequent enough or too frequent and creating patient burden or annoyance even. So there is that fine line, and ECOA scientists can help you determine what strategy is really best and optimal for an alarm notifications. And shown here are just two examples of the types of high compliance you can get with an electronic diary. And I show these because I think these are great examples of how alarms can drive compliance and how electronic data capture can really ensure you're getting true compliance. So meaning the compliance or the patient is actually completing the diary when they are supposed to, and not, for example, in the parking lot right before a visit. So these are two studies. One was in the US and one was in the APAC region. They're both very similar in design in that they were investigating acute treatment of migraine. So meaning the patient starts experiencing a migraine at home, they log into their diary, they report the start of that migraine, they report taking their medication, and then that triggers these alarms and these windows of availability to then report their pain at certain time intervals after they take their medication. So at 15 minutes, they have to report their pain, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hour, etc. So a pretty intensive schedule that we're relying on patients to be completing. So you can see how this would be nearly impossible or very challenging to do on paper, as there would be absolutely no guarantee that the patient is actually completing it at the specified time point, right? They could take their medication, return 1 day later and fill out all of these time points. And that could introduce bias, recall bias, etc. So with electronic data capture here, we're not only providing that assurance that the participant is completing the diary at these actual times, at the right time, so that true compliance, but we have the ability to use alarms to really help the patient remember then to complete that diary when they're supposed to. So in these examples, we use best practices for diary design, making it easy for the patient and use the right alarm strategy. And we were able to get, really phenomenal overall compliance rates. You see an average of 98% and 96%. So even for these really intensive diaries, which is almost an extreme example, right, where it's just a great example of how electronic data capture can really increase the compliance rates with all of the tools that electronic can bring. And then when we think about, patient engagement as well, so it really goes beyond compliance, and you really want the patient to feel engaged and part of the clinical trial. The ECOA device can really house more than just the diary, but other key study information. So in addition to their diaries, the patients can have all that relevant information in one place, those study visit guides, the study FAQs, disease-related materials, and this can really increase preparedness of the patient to be prepared for the trial and reduce burden as well, having all that information in one place. It can also provide kind of those real-time data insights to patients. And what I mean by that is giving them, visuals of how their compliance is. How are they going? You've completed, 6 of your 7 diaries this week. Keep up the good work. So it's a way that we can actually deliver that type of motivational messaging, and that can be based on their level of compliance. So it's that personalized messaging, and it's an avenue where we can, provide training right on the device for the patient. So it's really that avenue for having all the key study information for the patient in one place and keeping them engaged.
It's a perfect example, Kelly, and really the more and more we talk about ECOA, it's ECOA plus something else, right? Is it engaging content, training, e-consent, telehealth, right? It's not just ECOA. There are so many more technologies we can leverage as we think about it. So it's a good segue to the very last point before we get to Q&A, because we can't get through a webinar these days without talking about it. DCT, Brian, decentralized trials, what are they? How does this impact from an ECOA perspective?
So thanks, Chris. I think the million-dollar question is, what is a decentralized trial? We very much see a whole world of different definitions coming across, so much so that the EMA recently declared that they would not be defining what a decentralized trial is. However, the recurring themes that come across from all the definitions is digitalization, the use of technology, and patient centricity. I think they're the key 2 cornerstone foundation stones for decentralized trials. Now, there are differences between a digitalized trial and a decentralized trial, which may cause some confusion. And I think that's just to elaborate a little piece on that. The left-hand side with the digitalized trial. In a fully digitalized trial, it's using technologies, there will be no paper. The digital components can be sitting anywhere, whether it's at home or at the investigational site, indeed anywhere. And there'll be technical decisions about what technology should be used. The right-hand side, we have decentralized trials. A fully decentralized trial is one in which there are all assessments are done away from the investigational site. This, in theory, can be done without any technologies if you want to use paper CRFs, paper diaries, and use mail and posting. It would be incredibly inefficient. So when we start to blend digitalized trials and decentralized trials, we begin to understand that as we get a greater overlap with the digitalization and the decentralizations, you see much greater efficiencies. So as we start looking at ECOA, just going back to saying ECOA now, and the digitalization of electronic diaries, that brings efficiencies and enables greater use of decentralized trials. Beyond that, we talked about a little bit more, there's additional connected devices that can also be loaded up through the eDiary portal, if I may use that term, which I think in the interest of time, we'll just show that briefly on the next slide, of all the various components that can also be added in. These may be respiratory components, it may be actigraphy, it could be glucose monitoring, it could be sleep, be cognitive tests that go in with this, could be blood pressure, could be indeed 6-lead ECGs, etc., depending very much so on what the protocol determines. Let's not use shiny new toys for the sake of them. Let's be firm. Let's put science first, use the technologies in the right way, in the responsible way, and really do advance clinical research the way we should do it, the way we all can believe we can do it better. Let's do that. Let's make it smarter. Let's make it happen. And I will end there, Chris.
No, perfect ending, Brian. I want to do one more audience participation. If we jump to the next one, let's see if we did this right. I know I learned a lot, but let's see if we did our homework and shared some good information here. So just want to find out from the group, what do you see as the biggest advantage for using ECOA in your study? We talked about a lot of this, right? Brian talked about access to real-time data, compliance, engagement. Because we have that real-time access to the data, essentially queries are reduced and we lead to faster database lock. Kelly talked about the increased compliance and engagement we get because we're able to see the data in real time. Compliance with regulations, Kelly and Donna talked a lot about what global regulators are saying and how we comply with that. And data quality, I think, was hit on a ton here. So I think, Smaya, we can load the results and see what the group thought before we go to the Q&A. Nice. Okay, so data quality. So I mean, I think that was one of the most important things we wanted to get across today, and the compliance and engagement. Right. Again, we're at Clario not selling a device or a technology. We're selling regulatory compliant, high quality data, and that increased compliance and engagement is paramount to making sure we get that. So I'm glad that came through today. So if we go to the last slide before Q&A, I learned a ton today. I hope everyone else did. Please feel free to not let the conversation stop here. There's a full science team at Clario beyond Kelly and Brian, so you can reach them at science@clario.com if you have questions. Brian and Kelly have very nicely included their own personal email addresses here, so feel free to plug their inboxes with questions as well. But I do want to get to the question and answer. There are so many in the chat. I'm not sure exactly where to begin, so we'll try to get to 2 or 3 of these, realizing we're in the end of the session here. But first one, and maybe Kelly, this is for you. We didn't touch on this a ton, as I'm glad this is brought up. What is the role of training in conjunction with ECOA, and what are some training methodologies to help participants understand what's required of them?
Yeah, so training will be really important in a good ECOA strategy and in a COA strategy generally. So when we're introducing any ECOA device or system, you know, first of all, we want to make sure the patient knows how to use the device. And as Donna mentioned, everyone, you know, is very familiar with technology, but and this is a regulatory compliant note too. I mean, it's important that the patient gets to practice, get to use the device to understand just the technical navigation, but it goes so much beyond that, where it's so important to train the patient on not only the device, but the PROs on their role and responsibilities. So making sure that they understand the importance of accurate reporting. There's no right or wrong answer. And a couple of the regulations, like the EMA oncology regulation, specifically calls out that you need to be communicating to patients the importance of PROs. And that will in turn help with patient engagement and compliance. So making sure that they understand their role and responsibilities, when the diaries will become available, how to accurately report, honest and accurate reporting. That's going to be really important. And then from the site's perspective, I mean, the site staff have a really big role in communicating that message to patients too. So training for sites might be important for, again, not only the ECOA system itself, of course, that's important, but training them to make sure that they're being consistent in their communication to patients about the importance of PROs and their role in the trial.
Perfect. Thanks for that one, Kelly. I can't see who asked the questions. I want to give this person a hug, so I'm gonna read this one. I'm seeing newer vendors moving away from more traditional study designs to looser designs without ECO best practices. For the foreseeable future, will Clario continue to stay more traditional? In parentheses, I like this. I'll start out by saying the benefit of working with Clario is because we've done this over 4,000 times, and we will always default back to those best practices and lessons learned and things that no one else will know because we've done it this many times. But the question I'll put to Brian, what's the role of your full science team in development of the ECOA proposal and the ECOA solution and implementation of that solution in the trial?
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for that great question. Of course, here at Clario, we really do pride ourselves on delivering the best practices, best designs across the board. From my great luck of having a phenomenal science team, we come together to look at the proposals as they come in, give some light touch consultancy to give some feedback, then work with our customers and clients to really help them understand where, what the goals are for each of these protocols and programs, while working and understanding and translating these protocols in clinician medical terms so that our designers can help design these tools as they should be to really capture the medical and scientific goals for each of these protocols. Ensure we've got the right instruments in place, ensure we've got the right design set up, and that's along about having patient flexibility, and Kelly spoke about alarms, et cetera, make sure we engage with those patients and build towards them so that we can really walk away and feel that we're going to be able to have a successful study with our clients time in, time out.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. And just in the last minute, I don't want to leave Donna out, right? I feel like I have one, I think that is geared maybe towards you, Donna. The person is asking, is it useful for COAs to be captured always associated with an endpoint, or is there value to capturing COAs even without being associated with an endpoint in clinical development?
Interesting question. I would think you'd have to stay true to your protocol to start with. You don't want to start asking noisy questions. But if what the person who wrote this question is meaning, I think there is value in asking a question about, did you take your study medication today? May not be part of an endpoint, but it's a great way for that patient to remember to take their study medication at the right time every day. So there is surrounding questions that is not endpoint related, but will support your endpoint. So if you're measuring pain and you're not taking study medication, what's the point of measuring the pain? So it's, in that sense, I think there is some value. And from a safety point of view as well, I think suicidality is another important. Often this is included as a safety signal and not necessarily an endpoint, whereas suicide ideation behavior in some, depending on what drug you're using, about crossing the brain barrier and all of that, should be part of a safety endpoint, not endpoint, but a safety signal as well.
All right. With that, I will hold it there. I will wrap it. My panelists, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. We greatly appreciate it. I learned a ton today. I hope the audience did too. And with that, Smile, I'll turn it to you to close us down.
Thank you very much, everyone. And if you do have more questions, you can direct them to the contact information again on your screen. So go ahead, quickly jot them down if you haven't already. So thank you again, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. Now I'm about to send you a link in your chat box. You can share this with your colleagues. This is where the archive will be up. So go ahead and quickly take that down as well. Now give us a big thank you to our speakers again, Donna Reed, Brian McDowell, Kelly Dumas, and Chris Vogel for that fantastic presentation. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.